started the recording for you, and I'm trying to figure out which is slide 12. Is that it? No, that's 14.
Just
How about that one?
go forward right? One. There should be an 11 at the lower right. There you go, perfect. So let me go ahead and kick this off. Some of you may recall that I talked a little bit about our efforts last year. And for those that were not familiar with that previous work, I'm going to start with a summary of what we called Phase 1. But let me set the stage quickly. ACM has long provided curricular guidance, both at the baccalaureate and at the associate degree level, in various areas of computing, with an ING, specifically domains such as computer science, computer engineering, information science, things of that sort. We were then asked, the two-year college group, to do something similar with regard to IT. And we pulled a group together, and the group basically said, well, that's sort of impossible, because domains such as computer science or computer engineering are fairly well defined, but when you use a phrase like IT or ICT, you really are talking about an umbrella term under which there are many paths that students might pursue depending on their particular interest. It might be a programming degree, a networking degree, a web degree of some sort. To wit, James's comments in the opening session this morning. And so the task force we pulled together said, but here's what you could do. And so that's the summary of Phase 1 that we see in front of us. You could, first of all, take the approach of building on a framework of learning outcomes, not so much the traditional notion of a knowledge base, but really look at learning outcomes. Then what you could do is look at students pursuing all sorts of IT programs, IT tracks, IT degrees, and you could see what's common to everybody. What should everybody have? And if you do that, make sure it's influenced by business and industry and that it's international in application, because ACM is an international organization. Now, of course, we're very familiar in the U.S. and in Canada with the community college system. Generally, those correspond to technical schools in places like China and India and Europe. And then the task force said, and oh, by the way, since you're going to build this around learning outcomes, you got to have assessment rubrics to go with it. Okay. So with that, let's move on to the next slide, and we'll talk about how do we actually approach this with our so-called Phase 2. All right, so Phase 2 takes that charge, and if we move to the next slide, please. The first thing to do is to work on these items I highlighted in red. So what do we mean by a framework of defined competency domains? And how do you become well influenced by business and industry and certification bodies and such? And how do these things have staying power? And how on earth do you make something like this international in application? So that's the challenge that we want to start with, is from the overall collection of bullets, how do we deal with these 4 red ones? So here we go. Let's go to the next slide, please. And here we see the very same picture that James put up in his comments, the model from the U.S. Department of Labor. And as James noted, if you look at that yellow band kind of right in the middle that says industry-wide technical competencies, you see some headings. I'm going to give you a clearer view here in a minute. But notice, of course, that those sit on top of so-called workplace competencies. And it shouldn't be overlooked that we're expected often, as community college faculty in particular, to teach those workplace competencies, or at least to immerse our students in a setting where such competencies are nurtured and reinforced. And then we all know the challenges of the academic competencies that underride all of this. All right, so let's go to the next slide. And in the next slide, what I do is I pull out the technical competencies and I just give you the headings, and a few words about what defines these. Now, in fairness, let's look at the first one for the moment. Principles of IT. There's a blurb there as to what that means. Again, this is in the context of the U.S. Department of Labor model. But to be fair, there are two important sections that are omitted, and those are my indents: critical work functions and technical content areas. For each of these headings, the U.S. DOL model defines a collection of bullets as critical work functions, and they really are work functions. They're things that people in this kind of job should be able to do. And technical content areas, which really, generally speaking, are topics. Some of them are written as though they are outcomes, but that's not a specific sort of charge by the Department of Labor. All right, so these exist for all these categories. Now let's just pause and look at this for a moment. Principles of IT sounds kind of broad, but then we get into databases and apps, networking, software development. You can see these headings and you can read these blurbs. If you're a faculty member, these kinds of headings probably strike you with some familiarity because they, I'm going to suggest they tend to be the way that we organize curriculum. Let's move to the next slide, please. And then the next one, this is just a continuation of the list. Again, you can read user support, digital media. Now, compliance tends not to be a sort of program track, so that's a little different. And risk management and security and information assurance, well, of course, we do see programs, or certainly certificates, around various aspects of security, cybersecurity, and information assurance in those fields. But again, this one's a little more cross-cutting. But still, I'm going to suggest that these largely sound like the sort of groupings that academicians and faculty would come up with. Now let's go to the next slide. And in the next slide, we're going to take another input. We're going to take this one from Europe. This is the e-Competence framework from the European Union. And notice, of course, that they use the term ICT professionals. And I love just in the heading where they say, in all industry sectors. Again, I feel like I'm James's cheerleader from his comments this morning, because these are points that he makes very articulately. All right, so the European Union does theirs a little bit differently. They don't have a colorful pyramid the way that the U.S. Department of Labor does. They group theirs under some major headings. Now the first one is called Plan, and then you can see these subheadings there. There's a lot of content underneath these, and in fact there's about 30 of these things. We'll just look at the headings. It's not critical that you see how these are all defined at a detailed level. They more or less speak for themselves. But what I do want to point out is I'm going to suggest there's a difference in tone. If you look at these headings, first of all, plan is a bit more of an active verb than the level in the Department of Labor pyramid. And if you look here, you see words like management and planning and design. These words sound a little different than the ones we saw in the U.S. Department of Labor model. All right, let's go to the next slide. And then the next slide we see a continuation. So the first group was plan, then we have build, then we have run. What you begin to sense here is that this is much more from the perspective of business and industry. Now, the U.S. model doesn't define itself specifically as we want to represent the perspective of faculty. That certainly is not their intent whatsoever. But I'm going to say that when you look at the European Union one, I think just in the language that's used, you can see that it sounds like it's coming much more heavily influenced by a business setting. So again, you can see these. I don't have to read them to you. Build and run are major headings with these categories underneath. So let's go to the next slide. The next one is the enable category. And some of these you might start to say, now wait a minute. Bob, if your group is looking at associate degrees, these things start to sound pretty heady. I don't think my associate degree students or my certificate students are going to be doing sales proposal development, and that doesn't even sound like an IT thing. It sounds like it belongs in a business curriculum. So if you were to make such an observation, I'd say, yeah, I agree. Let's go to the next slide. The next slide is labeled Manage, and certainly now you could have that notion that says you're really sort of pushing well beyond where our students might be. So let's go to the next slide. And what we'll see in the next one is, in fact, there are 5 levels. Now, all I did was take the very first bullet that we saw under Plan a moment ago, and I just wanted to show you that for each one of these major headings, this is what the EU provides. So first, skip the green stuff. The bottom half, you see what they call knowledge examples. Now remember, that kind of relates to the topics that we saw in the US model. And then underneath that, skills examples, so that's able to, and that relates to the job functions that we saw in the US model. So certainly there are similarities between the two. But here, as you can see in the green section, level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4, level 5, this particular one kicks in at levels 4 and 5. So what they're trying to capture is, remember their heading? Remember I pointed out that the heading on this document is IT competencies in all fields. They're really capturing the workplace and recognizing that IT or ICT manifests itself at different levels in different ways in different work environments. Okay, well our purpose today is not to talk about this model in any more detail than that, except to say it seems to have similarities to the US model. It seems to have distinctions. It seems to be a little more representative of the industry perspective. So let's go to the next slide. And in this slide, I identify various inputs that our committee has used to try to hone in on what is this framework. Remember a moment ago I showed you the summary from phase 1, and I identified a collection of red items and called that step 1 of phase 2. Part of that is to get a handle on what do we mean by a framework for these learning outcomes. So in addition to the US Department of Labor and the European Union, we looked at EMC's work, SIGITE's work, this work of the CSTA, the ESSEC model that was shared at the SIGITE conference in the fall. And from these things, we came up with what we believe to be the approach that best serves us. So let's go to the next slide. So we first identified what we're calling technical domains, and there are 6 of them, and they all fit on one slide, so that's very useful. All right, again, you can read these for yourself. Programming and app development, database and information management, service storage and virtualization. Networking and convergence, client computing, digital media and immersive technology. So you might say to yourself, or you might say to me, you know, Bob, this again sounds like the way that we organize curricula begins to sound like what might have been perceived as a shortcoming of the US Department of Labor model, or at least an observation. And if you said that, I would say, yes, that's exactly right. These tend to be curriculum areas. These tend to be tracks or programs under that big heading of IT. Now, let's pause here for a moment before I show you the next slide where we try to balance this. And let me talk a little bit about process. Our charge is to identify the learning outcomes that are applicable to students irrespective of what IT track or program they are pursuing at the associate degree level. Put another way, what should everybody be able to do? What should everybody know? If you are in a program that focuses on desktop support, what should you know about networking? What should you know about programming? If you're in a programming track, what should you know about cloud storage, whatever it may be? So if you imagine that you're a participant in answering that question, obviously you would have expertise probably in one of these 6 areas that are on the screen in front of you. So suppose you are an instructor and you're teaching the Cisco networking curriculum. Certainly your expertise goes beyond networking to touch on some of these other areas. But you may say, but you know what, I don't know a whole lot about programming. But you could certainly speculate on what from the networking domain you believe programming students should know, even if they're not going to go into networking. Now, you would probably anticipate getting some pushback on people that teach programming saying, yeah, that sounds about right, or wait a minute, I think that's too specialized for my students. That's the dynamic that we have to manage. And that's the dynamic that we have to find the comfortable boundaries. So another way to say that is, how can we ensure that people that have subject matter expertise in one of these technical domains is thinking broadly about students in other domains? That takes us to the next slide. So in this next slide, which I parenthetically label breadth, you may have noticed that the previous one was parenthetically labeled depth. Here we look at what we identify as conceptual domains. Now it may be the case that some of these are in fact curricular areas, but certainly that's not the expectation, it's not the intent. It's okay if it happens. There's nothing wrong with that, but that's not the design. The idea here is that there are areas that are more cross-cutting. So whereas programming and networking, we might think of those in a vertical sense, these should be considered areas that cut across those. Now the best example of this is security. Because many, many people, when they talk about security, they will immediately start using phrases like, well, security applies to every aspect of IT, which is, of course, true. So we would posit that there are other things that apply potentially to every area. And those we identify as conceptual domains. Okay, so let's kind of look at these quickly. Design, development, and testing pretty much speaks for itself. Human-computer interaction is more interesting, especially these days, especially after those extraordinary observations by the keynote address this morning. And here we get into, obviously, mobile platforms as well. Security, we all understand how that cuts across many IT domains. Systems integration and solution deployment gets to the idea of how do you have confidence that what you're doing fits well hand in hand with other IT systems in place. And I'm going to suggest that, again, this underscores what James was talking about, that so many jobs now are built around IT systems, and IT systems don't stand in isolation. Sustainable IT, a lot of people call it green IT, is something that I think there's a lot of awareness about, especially from the consumer perspective. But we tend to think of it in terms of, don't just throw stuff in the trash can. And we think about, oh, let's have consolidated data centers. What we don't think about is, well, gee, how about when you write code as a programmer, you ensure that your code executes as efficiently as possible so you're using less cycles and therefore using less energy. So again, we identify this as something that cuts across technical domains. If we can move to the next slide. Here we finish off these conceptual domains, risk management and business continuity. We saw that specifically in both the U.S. Department of Labor and the EU. Business context is something that's like a personal issue of mine. I think we do far too little to prepare students to understand that their IT skills will be executed in the context of some particular business, and that business has a big influence on the manner in which their IT skills are integrated. Business intelligence and big data, of course, cloud computing, and oh my God, how do we deal with analytics and things of that sort. Project planning, we hear this, pretty often. I think we don't often hear a lot of conversation about change management. And professionalism. Professionalism seems like it's been one of these kinds of topics for a long time, something that people have long recognized is an important, perhaps not skill, perhaps awareness for our students. Okay, so that's a pretty long list of conceptual domains. I've identified the technical domains as indicators of depth, and I use the word vertical. And with regard to the conceptual domains, I used a word like breadth, and I used a phrase like cross-cutting. So of course, you know where I'm going. If we look at the next slide, we put these together into a matrix. Now, I'm not sure how clearly you can read these headings, but I will tell you that the column headings across the top are those technical domains, and faculty and business people will very comfortably see themselves typically as having expertise in one or more of those vertical columns. The rows are labeled with our conceptual domains headings, and now you can see why I used a phrase like cross-cutting. Now, you might look at some of these and you might say, Bob, I can understand how the row labeled human-computer interaction would show up, say, in the last column, digital media and immersive technology. And I can see how HCI, human-computer interaction, would show up, say, in the first column, programming, where maybe you're building a mobile app. But perhaps it's not so clear how human-computer interaction shows up, say, in the column labeled servers, storage, and virtualization. Maybe those are back-end functions, and we don't think about them so much as having, nice, friendly interfaces, because after all, these are sysadmins, and these people sort of immerse themselves in technology and think a little bit less, perhaps, about the interface. Okay, so suppose you made such an observation. To that I would say, that's fine. There's no problem there. There's nothing that suggests that every box in this matrix has to be populated. That's the whole point of the activity that we're going to pursue. Now, let's think about how this will move forward. What we want to do, what we intend to do, is fill out this matrix. So if you sitting there say, well, I'm very familiar with the Cisco networking curriculum or the Juniper Academy or the EMC Academy or some of those sorts of entities, and I can immediately think about the topics, I'm using the word topic there, the topics that constitute the curriculum in these various vertical columns, I would say that's great. Now what I want you to do is influence your thinking by identifying those things that are applicable not just to your own individual column, but to every column, right? So from the, I don't want to sound sort of biased toward the Cisco curriculum, but it's a very well established and well-known program. From all of the topics of study in the Cisco curriculum, which ones should we apply to every student? That's the charge. All right, so let's go to the next slide. And in the next slide, I identify a little bit prematurely, because this list is very dynamic. It changed as of even yesterday. We have some additional participants. But what we're doing is we're putting together subject matter experts from business and industry with two-year college faculty. Now, I want to pause here for a moment, and I want to acknowledge some of the work that Impact is doing currently. And you heard James speak about this again this morning, where they are taking the body of work from the U.S. Department of Labor and some other products as well, and they're reaching out to business and industry and saying, help us understand more about your perspective on these. So we're doing the same thing with our initiative. We're going to pair subject matter experts from business and industry with two-year college faculty that teach in various IT programs, and we're going to put them together and say, we want you to fill out this matrix. All right, I'm a little sensitive to the time, so let's jump ahead to the next slide. And what I'm going to suggest then is that with the materials I've introduced so far, effectively I can check off the 4 red items as being well prepared for now. So now we understand how the competency domains will be defined, technical and conceptual in the matrix that I showed you, how they'll be influenced by business and industry and certifying bodies, etc., through our project teams, how they are international in application, being influenced by a multitude of inputs, and the manner in which they have both breadth and adaptability. You can always argue staying power, but that ends up being a function of the content. So that leaves 2 that haven't been addressed. Let's go to the next slide then. And I'll mark those in red to be consistent and say, now let's talk about how do we address these 2 red bullets that are remaining. Learning outcomes and assessment rubrics. Okay, so we go to the next slide. And in the next slide, we identify that we're going to take those business and industry people and those two-year college faculty, and we're going to augment them with a team of assessment experts. If any of you have been through assessment training, you know that it can be a substantial body of skills to try to convey and to try to pick up. But we're going to do it sort of on the fly by bringing in a team of experts to orient business and industry and faculty, and then to sit side by side with them as they develop these materials. So we'll go to the next slide. Everybody's favorite, Bloom's taxonomy. This is the version that we're using, and I won't belabor this except to note that it goes from remembering up to creating, and I'm going to assume that the audience is somewhat familiar with Bloom's taxonomy, and you have a sense of this hierarchy of outcome activities by students. We'll go to the next slide. So at the next slide, and the next couple of slides we'll go through very quickly, and I'm just pointing out here that for a variety of activities that one can imagine either as activities that students engage in during their studies, or even in some cases workplace functions, for these activities one can associate a collection of verbs. And as you know, learning outcomes are all about verbs, measurable verbs. And understand is not a measurable verb, so even though this category is understand, that gets translated into the verbs that you see on the left for activities such as those on the right. And now we'll just go to the next slide. We'll move up a level to applying. Very similar. Briefly, you can see the sorts of verbs that exist here: investigate, implement, calculate, modify, manipulate. We'll go to the next slide, which talks about analyzing, certainly a much more compelling level than simply, say, remembering. And here we get into words like deconstruct and compare and contrast and decompose. And we'll go to the next slide, evaluating. At this point, you might pause and you might say, gee, Bob, if you're going to be defining outcomes applicable to all students in IT programs, really, you're this high up in Bloom's taxonomy? I mean, it might strike you that core competencies, by the very use of the word core, might not be at this level. But we'll see. We'll see. That's up to the project teams to determine. If we go to the next slide, we now leave the outcomes, and now we move into the notion of assessment. And there are lots and lots of different assessment models. I'm just illustrating here in this simple little chart that this is the one that we intend to use. For a given outcome, what defines a student being below our expectation, meeting the expectation, or exceeding the expectation? If you've done assessment rubrics or if you've defined assessment activities, you're very familiar with these ideas. If not, there's nothing terribly challenging about it. It really comes back to, it's all well and good to say that a student should be able to do something, and that's an outcome. The question then is, by what measure will you determine if indeed the student can do that thing? Let's go then to the next slide. And here's where it all comes together. So again, this is just the same matrix that I showed earlier, where we have our technical domain columns, we have our conceptual domain rows, and imagine in each box there are student learning outcomes. That's for the participant teams to come up with. They will populate that. And the fact that there's one box doesn't mean that there's one outcome. So let's take the simplest example. Under programming and application, the first column, when we look at the first row, design, development, and testing, there might be one outcome there, again, that's applicable to every IT student. There might be two. I doubt if there's more than two, but we'll see. So one box doesn't mean one outcome. One box can house whatever outcomes are appropriate. The example I gave earlier about sustainable IT intersecting programming in the form of students being able to write efficient code, well, if knowing how to write efficient code or being able to demonstrate that one can write efficient code at some level, if that's applicable to every IT program, then that's what goes in the box. That's the outcome that goes there. So this then provides a sort of spreadsheet. Now, this is only the first layer. Imagine a second layer behind this, and that goes to the gray boundary that says corresponding assessment rubric. That layer behind it would be, for each outcome in the front layer, the layer behind it would have the assessment rubric. So let me stay with my simple example. Being able to write code that executes efficiently, then behind that would be the rubric that says, well, by what activity will that be measured, and how will that activity identify or differentiate between students that fall short of it, that meet it, that exceed it. So with that end product then, we have a document that we can say we now define those core competencies for every IT program. These are the things that everybody should be able to do, and now we can use the word do, not words like should know, because they really are outcomes and they have assessment rubrics associated. So that takes us to our next slide, where I declare victory and say that the summary, the so-called scorecard from phase 1, we now have a plan for how to address each of these requirements. And it's just a matter of pulling the team together and saying, okay, we have a perfect plan, now let's execute it. Obviously I jest because, of course, things have to be dynamic and change on the fly, but that's our process. With that, let me take us to the final slide. I've done all the talking because I want to do everything I can to respect the time boundary, but certainly we urge feedback. If there's time, I'll be glad to field questions. If not, please send me your comments from Bob, this is great, to Bob, this is awful, to you guys are brilliant, to you guys are idiots. It really doesn't matter what the feedback is. We'll be better informed by it. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. I guess I can entertain a question or two, but we are pretty close to the time, and we've got to set up for the next presentation. So, any questions from the face-to-face audience? Go ahead.
Well, I was wondering how you see this coming together with MPIC study that's kind of similar, or is it not?
Question, Bob, is how does this come together with MPIC study, or does it not?
Well, we think it absolutely fits hand in glove with the work that MPIC and others are doing. Deborah has done a lot of work with business and industry through Baytech. So we don't pretend that this is necessarily unique. We don't pretend that it's the final answer. What we do suggest, though, is that it really tries hard to define itself as outcomes and assessment rubrics. The work that MPIC is doing in reaching out to business and industry is really defining workplace skills, workplace competencies, but we want to think in terms of what's a good tool to give to educators. So if MPIC's results can sort of verify and validate our results in terms of what people should be able to do, then we believe that the assessment rubric then can be handed off to faculty as a tool for their purposes. We also think that, much to James's point, we need some framework that starts to define what all of these IT programs are ultimately about. What is ICT? What does it really mean at its heart and soul? What are the core ideas there? So we very much hope that these efforts go together nicely.
Okay. And I'm afraid we're actually out of time because they're moving on to their next session. So thanks very much,
okay,
Bob, for a terrific presentation under trying circumstances.
Blaine, or should I say Vanna, thank you for your great assistance.
Okay.